blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night. We bring the vibes here. We full of life, you keep the change, keep the change. They hate and say we went and changed. I stay the same, you must be blinded by the lights. You must be blinded by the lights, lights. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh. We put the nets up in the lines, now we high, high, high. Kaleidoscope of colors beaming from our eyes, eyes. Would've thought was LSD, LSD. Can't lose my mind like Kennedy, Kennedy. You see us cooking recipes, recipes. You hit the top, all you left with is the memories. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, go hard to have it is your purpose. We had some faith, then who gon' hurt this? I naughty night, you lullaby. I'm doing me, it's do or die. You must be blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night. We bring the vibes here. We full of life, you keep the change, keep the change. They hate and say we went and changed. I stay the same, you must be blinded by the lights. You must be blinded by the lights, lights.
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 10 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Nature has always given us life. It's our duty to return the favor, a duty this region has been fulfilling for the last 50 years, and one that First Abu Dhabi Bank has been continuously committed to. It's why we are the region's pace setter in climate finance, and why we are the region's partner for climate action. It's this sense of purpose that has inspired us to partner with COP28. FAB, we always see more.
Please welcome to the stage Meg Szabo, Head of Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being back for day 2 of Bloomberg Green at COP28. We are, again, thrilled to be having you here at our Bloomberg Climate Hub in Dubai, so thank you for joining us. Today, you are going to hear from another bunch of amazing climate leaders that are working in the climate space. We're so thrilled to have you to see them all. But first, I have a couple of quick announcements that I'd like to share. First, I would like to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, the Climate Pledge, First Abu Dhabi Bank, Indiana Economic Development Corporation, McKinsey Sustainability, Mubadala Investment Company, Red Sea Global, and Standard Chartered. And our supporting sponsors, General Motors and Google. We would love to hear from you throughout the day today. The Wi-Fi details you can find on the back of your badge. You can also submit questions to our speakers and respond to our polls by scanning that QR code that's behind me that will flash throughout the day. I will be sitting there with an iPad, so just submit them virtually, and the moderators will look to me, and I can ask them that way. So please join us on that. And then you can also engage with us on social media using the hashtag #BloombergGreen. And with that, let's get started. We begin with a look at climate diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Fryer.
Secretary Kerry, thank you so much for making the time to join us. This has become something of an annual tradition for you to come to our Bloomberg Green Summit, so I know we have a very, very busy schedule, and we are very grateful to have you here. So let's dive right in. We've seen a flurry of announcements at this COP since we started last week that you've been involved in. There was methane, loss and damage, more than $50 in new funding. But now we're in the hard yards of COP negotiations. You said to Politico yesterday that the bottom line is that this COP needs to be committed to phasing out all unabated fossil fuel in the final text. Last night, Saudi Arabia's oil minister told Bloomberg in an interview that his country will not support any language around a phase down of fossil fuels. Does that make you worried that real ambition will get stymied at this COP by fossil fuel interests?
No, but let me begin first. First of all, John, great to be with you, and thank you to Bloomberg, and to Mike, particularly for his incredible commitment to this and what he's been able to do in a lot of fields, including getting rid of, literally, more than 500 coal plants in our country, and that's pretty significant, and we're doing pretty well, notwithstanding. But I want to begin just to underscore to everybody, because it's so critical. This moment is not just another moment. It's not inconsequential. It's not, it can't be business as usual in any regard. The dangers that we are facing, folks, and I am not an alarmist. I think most people know I've been pretty practical in trying to find solutions to challenges. But the dangers we face now are just monumental and even scary. And scientists are saying that. The best scientists in the world are saying what we face now is alarming, terrifying. These are quotes. And even we are in uncharted territory. Now, let me just say to you, it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in the Arctic last summer. it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in the Antarctic. And a massive ice sheet that has been tied up for whatever thousands of years, because it was so big and heavy, it was stuck in the mud, has now disappeared enough, melted enough that it floated, it's no longer stuck. It's moving out towards Georgia Island. It's going to melt. Just like 86 million metric tons of ice every single day in the Greenland. So we got to really decide, are we serious or are we fooling around with an existential issue? Existential. You hear that out of the mouths of sober politicians who are not playing politics, who really understand what's going on. So I do that as a preface because it has to be the guideline, the guidepost for everything we're thinking about and choosing to do. And the fact is, emissions are going up in too many places. And what the science says is, IPCC 2018, they could not have been more clear. They pointed the finger at all the people in positions of responsibility. You have 12 years within which to make the decisions and implement them, obviously, that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. That's science, mathematics, physics. And we're ignoring it in too many parts of the world. And so we're inviting the worst consequences. And we see what's happening. 18 $1 billion events in the US climate events last year, 18 $1 billion separate events. Meanwhile, 30 million people displaced in Pakistan, record fires in Greece and parts of the world. Come on, when do we get sort of, really focused on this? And by the way, I'll be very quick, this is not asking people to sacrifice, for God's sakes. We're not suggesting that in this transition to the new energy economy, a clean energy economy, you're going to have to give up something. On the contrary, 8 million people are dying every year around this planet from the bad air. It's pollution, folks. It's poison. And so, and yesterday or day before, I forget which, they blend together, we had a session on health, first ever session on health. The interconnection between health and climate. Largest cause of children being hospitalized in America every summer is environmentally induced asthma. We spend 55, 60 billion a year on that, for God's sakes. So I'll come into you, I promise, but I just want everybody.
But we are here now. I think you've laid the table out very, very well.
Okay, here it is.
Yes.
We'll come in.
So the Saudis last night said, we will not support
what they said is they'll not support an actual phase out, but I'm not here to excuse, look, he can speak for himself and he did yesterday. What we are for, the United States has said, and we said it in the G7, and all G7 members voted for this, that we are for the phase out of all unabated fossil fuel. Unabated. Why? Because the science says you have to reduce the emissions. And how can we be reducing the emissions if we're building a whole new set of coal-fired power plants, so forth? And they are in Asia. 550 gigawatts of coal power is backed up in the line for construction and permitting. So we're saying don't permit. And does that mean somebody's got to take a haircut? Yep. Does that mean we've got to come up with some kind of measurement of how we're going to manage these things? Yeah. And it's not irrational what I'm saying. What is irrational is permitting an unabated coal-fired power plant, which wipes out all the gains of other countries who are trying to do renewables and trying to do hydrogen, a whole bunch of different things. So we're for that.
Are you worried about a blocking coalition here
no,
at this COP?
No,
you have
because
the Russians, you have the Saudis, all very worried about this language around phasing down.
We've worked very closely with everybody, and we're working with them right now. There's a reason we were able to get a new fund for climate impact response, and that is that we worked all summer with transition committee meeting. We pushed in, even had one several weeks ago to try to resolve it, the 5th committee meeting, and we came to an agreement on the framework that we needed to make this happen. And think about it, 195 countries came to an agreement on this new fund with the modalities. We supported it. I even pushed in Sharm el-Sheikh that we would not just do it 2 years from now, which is what was perfectly agreeable to people, But I said, no, if this is really urgent, we should do it next year, not wait, not make the developing world think that we're not serious by just pushing it off. So we did it. Never has a COP ever passed on the first day anything, let alone something that was fairly controversial. We did. And in addition to that, we've had the first ever health day. We've had the first ever gender day. Because women, absolutely inevitably, most parts of the world are the biggest victims of the climate crisis because they do, the caretaking of the family, the getting the food, building finding some means of cooking the food and so forth. And they are also the most vulnerable in the sense that when there is a crisis, they're the ones who usually pay the highest.
If I could drag you back one last time to the question.
You don't have to drag me.
So are you confident that we will get phasing out of unabated fossil fuels?
I don't know. I'm not saying what it will be. I'm saying we will find a way to do something that I think is realistic and finds the appropriate terminology and framework within which to be able to do our job.
The other point that the Saudis and others make is about hypocrisy. They're being called on to do more, and yet they would point out that I think right now the US is producing a record amount of oil itself, just as you're making these calls. Isn't it time for the US to walk the walk on this as well?
Well, we are walking the walk. On the contrary, President Biden has done more than any other president in history. And he got the IRA passed, and the IRA was $369 billion of tax incentive. But because it doesn't have a ceiling, it has a floor, we've probably got about $1 trillion already, and it's moving like crazy. And there's more money, venture capital, $1.7 trillion moving into that sector than we ever imagined. So we're seeing a lot going on. I'm actually really encouraged, to be truthful with you. I think that there's just a change of spirit. Actually, there's a change of spirit in this COP. And I've been to COP since 1992 when we created the framework of the UN Convention in Rio. And I can tell you, I've never seen one that's more ambitious, that's pulling as many different threads of how we respond together. So we have a shipping challenge. Let me just share with you. We have, well, first of all, we had sunny lands. We spent 4 days with the Chinese. We came up with an agreement with the Chinese that all greenhouse gases will be contained in NDCs now going forward. That's a big deal, because even China didn't even include their NDC. In addition, we agreed that we will both accelerate the deployment of renewables with a specific view to having a deployment of additional, to reducing emissions in the 2020s, which is a real move for China to accelerate. We have a methane summit just the other day. We expected to probably raise about $200 million in order to help countries reduce their methane. Over $1 billion on the table, real money. We got 6 oil and gas companies who have committed that they're going to do $25 million each in order to specifically help countries to be able to change. So Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, which joined the methane pledge. We had Angola, Kenya, Romania, Kosovo, all joined the pledge. So we're up at about 155 countries now that have pledged to do 30% reduction globally of methane by 2030. Pretty damn good. And we're on track, we're moving. We also have a new ability through satellites to trace the footprints. And any of you, represent big-time international corporations with footprints around the world. You can run, but you can't hide now. There's going to be an ability to trace every hour and a half. That satellites go around the planet, and they're going to be beating in on that. We can pinpoint methane leaks in various parts of the world, and we will. And we'll name and shame, and we'll be pushing like crazy to be out there getting this transition done. But there are a whole bunch of other things that have happened here.
Can I just push you on the Sunnylands point? So that was obviously, we saw this sort of side-by-side announcements from China and the US pledging greater cooperation. And yet at the same time, they continue to build coal plants. Does that sort of highlight the frustrations of and the contradictions of climate diplomacy? That
no.
We say one thing here, and we pledge, we make these noises here, and yet when...
Well, it highlights a difficulty, not the contradiction. It also highlights the complications of the realities of the marketplace. We are blessed. Yes, we are the largest oil and gas producer in the world, the U.S. But we're also living out a legitimate track to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And yeah, there's a slight bleep up, and I don't like it, but I understand it. And there's just a reflection of demand, massive demand. And we can't just come at this from the supply side, we've also got to come at it on the demand side. So IRA is a demand signal, massive, and it's having an impact. And there are other demand signals. The IEA, Fatih Birol and company, have come out with an analysis that they say they have detected an earlier peak in global demand on fossil fuels, and they foresee it somewhere in the next couple of years because of the rapid rate of electric vehicle deployment and also the rapid rate of renewable deployment. So the demand is already, they're saying this is a terminal decline, by the way, terminal. So if I'm an analyst on Wall Street, I'm going to look a little differently at oil and gas companies for the long haul here, and that will accelerate things. Also, job growth in the United States, greater in renewable sector than in fossil fuel. And many of the people in fossil fuel are finding it very easy to transition into these other disciplines because they have the skill sets, extraction and so forth. So I think we're just living in a very new world here. And I think here's the problem. And I'm not, everybody knows I'm not an apologist for China. I don't think there is one in the United States right now. But it's a fact, China only had coal and nuclear. They're building 22 nuclear plants. They are also building, manufacturing, and deploying more renewables than all the other countries in the world put together. And it's conceivable that China will have upwards of 3,000 gigawatts of new renewable power by 2030. So you got to look at this realistically. Yeah, they have these coal plants there, but they insist that they're the minimal backup for base load. They're the minimal backup. They want to find out how can we do a better job dealing with our grid? How do we integrate the grid? AI will play a role in this. But boy, we have all the tools, folks, that people are working on now. I just went up to Commonwealth Fusion in Massachusetts the other day, and it's really exciting what's happening there. And by 2028 or 29, they're going to be producing enough heat in a incipient commercial manner that their next round, already they're looking at the build out beyond that, will be a real commercial enterprise in fusion. That could be it could be a huge game changer. And there are about 10 different places, companies that are chasing this. 2 or 3 of them are probably the most realistic, and we'll see where it goes.
Just getting back to US oil, one of the most notable things about this COP is how fossil fuel companies have been involved. There's, I think, more than 50 private and state-owned fossil fuel companies signed the methane pledge, and yet, we saw that Chevron and Exxon are not paying into the grant fund meant to help state-run oil companies cut their methane emissions. Do you think American oil and gas companies have now gotten religion on net zero?
Well,
are they now on that road with you?
Not all of them, no, regrettably. But let me be fair here. I want to be very fair. ExxonMobil is working with us on a plan they have to do an in-kind effort with on-the-ground training and working with people and being able to be helpful on methane. So they clearly are in a different, they're moving differently than Chevron. And we're hoping to close that out in the next hours, if not a couple of days. We'll work with the World Bank and have a manner of being really, hopefully, effective.
What more can Chevron do?
Beg your pardon?
What more can Chevron do?
Everything.
Tell me more.
Well, I very respectfully would just say that you can't be outside of this initiative. And we have no real evidence that they and a lot of others are doing what every company needs to do. Scope 1, Scope 2, methane 100% by 2030. This is what companies signed up for, by the way, in the initiative. I'm not sure who it came from, Saudi or somebody, but anyway, it was announced that there is this global decarbonization alliance, and these companies have come together. And look, it's not insignificant. You know, a lot of criticism is leveled at the UAE, but the fact is that this is the first time ever that those companies have come to the table at a COP. Mm-hmm. And what they've agreed to do is not enough in my judgment, but I'd rather have them doing it than not doing it. And that is a pledge to do net zero 2050, a pledge to do scope 1 and 2 by 2030, a pledge to do all methane by 2030, which is really important for us, and to raise their capex on renewables, and to a couple of other things. But bottom line is we need, well, look, we've got to be honest here with each other, everybody, and that requires the oil and gas companies to be as equally honest with us. The evidence is overwhelming. There is no doubt about the science. And that is why I say it is inexcusable. There's no reason to be permitting unabated efforts at this point. This is an urgency, folks. And so we have to get them to stop flaring. We got a whole bunch of flaring down in Texas. Not only is it a stupid thing to do because you're wasting gas that you could be selling, but it's dangerous and damaging to the atmosphere. Methane, folks, is 80 to 100 times more destructive than CO2 in its early years of exposure, and when it just leaks as methane. When you burn it, you get CO2. But when it's leaking and you're flaring, it just is not helpful. Iraq is one of the big flarers in the world, but they've agreed to try to work at this. We're sending people in to help them do it. And getting rid of those things, dealing with methane, folks, is not high tech. It's not complicated. It's basic plumbing. You know, tighten the screws, put in a new joint in your connectors, and it's also the single fastest, biggest, easiest, least expensive gain on holding the temperature at 1.5 degrees. So if you do the methane pledge, you're actually notching about 0.1 degrees, maybe 0.2 of cooling, actually, of keeping the planet less warm. So that's another reason to want to do it. And you ask me, where are some of these other companies? They're not doing that. Mm-hmm. They ought to be doing that. They ought to be leading the charge. Not to mention that there's only one simple reason we are in the predicament we are in. No rocket science needed, no new algorithm, no mathematician genius. This is happening because we burn fossil fuel unabatedly in the world. And that's what's doing this.
So in the time we have left, I'd like to talk about the future. So you can feel American leadership at this, at this COP. We've made progress, but hanging over all of this, of course, is the prospect of Donald Trump coming back into the White House next year.
That hangover? I don't think so.
That's journalistic license. If he gets in, the prospect there's this prospect that all of this could be for naught. So that begs perhaps an awkward and difficult question. How good is the word of the United States on the international stage at this point?
I think it's 100% good, and I think that nightmarish prospect, I'm not allowed to comment on politics, actually, so I shouldn't.
Well, I'm not stopping you. I'm sure the room would love to hear
You'd love
all
it.
of your thoughts.
My body language was enough of a...
Yeah.
Folks, no, I am not worried. Honestly, could he or someone else who doesn't want to listen to the science, who doesn't read about it and doesn't care about the facts, have an impact? Sure. But they're not going to turn this around. They're not going to stop this. I will say to you, they're not going to stop what is happening on a global basis. This economic transformation is going to be the biggest transformation in human history. It's bigger by far than the Industrial Revolution, and it is going to happen. I have no question but that we're going to get to a low carbon, no carbon economy globally. I just don't know if we're going to get there in time to avoid the worst consequences I warned about earlier. That's the issue. That's why we have to accelerate everything. We know we can do it, folks. The IEA tells us that if we just deployed more renewables between now and 2030, we can meet our 2030 goals just with renewables. I mean, my God, Germany is getting up above 50% renewable. Other countries are at 80%, 70%, and they're not having problems balancing their energy supply. Their base load is fine. And there are ways to be able to do that, regionally and globally, if you can connect grids, which we can do. I mean, France sends Germany nuclear power. Norway sends Germany and other parts of Europe gas with pipeline. And we can do these things. We can connect these things. But we have to work at it in a really authoritative way. But look, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, they're both part of our First Movers Coalition, by the way. We created a coalition now of about 100 companies. Biggest, best companies in the world, as far as I'm concerned. You got Google and Apple and Microsoft and Salesforce and FedEx, Ford, General Motors, run the list, Boeing, United Airlines, big companies, MasterCard, big companies with big interests. And their CEOs are smart, and they've made smart decisions, and they're out there out front. They're buying green now to accelerate the message to the marketplace that you can do it. So Volvo, Ford, General Motors are buying 10% of the steel that they buy for manufacturing their cars is green steel. Lafarge-Holcim, largest cement maker in the world, making green cement. People are buying it not because it's green, but because it's really better. And you can run a list of these things.
But if I'm an oil company, you've been criticizing some of the oil companies, is there not a risk that, I'll hear that criticism and I'll think to myself, well, all I need to do really is wait this out for another year, and the other guy or the other party will be back in. I can just humor them and don't need to do anything.
But what I'm saying to you, you're missing, or I'm not being articulate enough, and I need to say more. I don't believe that will happen. And the point I'm making is, if the CEOs of Ford and General Motors and Volkswagen and Hyundai and Toyota and Mercedes and BMW and blah, blah, if they've all decided to spend billions of dollars retooling their plants in order to make electric cars, you think they're suddenly going to decide because some politician in Washington or somewhere says, I don't like what we're doing? You think they're going to suddenly go back, let's go back and make internal combustion engine cars? Not on your life. And every one of you here knows that. There's no going back. People are putting billions now. We have $1.7 trillion of venture capital moving into this sector. We're making headway on bringing the price of hydrogen down. Ammonia, we have the first ammonia ship is in here in port in Dubai. Fortescue, Andrew Forrest, has brought their ship out, proving you can run them on that thing. I just met the other day with the Prime Minister of Norway. He and I joined together to lead a thing called the Shipping Challenge, Green Shipping Challenge. We have Yara, Maersk, and MSC, all of whom have committed to buy and build or lease carbon-free ships. Because of the IMO decision, which we all worked on creating this summer, which has raised the requirements for shipping, we're going to see a complete turnover in the world's shipping fleet in the next 20 years. That's incredible, because shipping, if it were a country on its own, would be the 8th largest emitter in the world. So we're chopping away here, we're chopping away there. And I'm telling you, these countries aren't going to stop. Even when Donald Trump was president, 75% of the new electricity in the United States of America came exclusively from renewables. Now, obviously, he didn't know it, or he would have stopped that or tried to. But that's the reality, folks. It's happening. Governors, Republican governors, Democrat, they're coming together. They work together. Mayors all across America, more than 1,000 mayors are committed to this. So even though Trump pulled out of the, I'm proud to say this, even though Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, the American people did not. We stayed in it, and that's why we're able to come back.
So unfortunately, we are nearly out of time, but I have one final question for you. You mightn't like it. You will be 80 next week, I noticed.
God damn you already.
This is a grueling and bruising business.
Yeah.
Do you still have stomach for the fight? Will we see you at the next COP next year, wherever that is?
Well, you see me at the next COP.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I'll be doing.
In this job, I should say.
I have no idea. Honestly, I will be engaged in this effort till we win the fight, and I have my last breath, period, one way or the other. The private sector, I might add to all of you, I think what you guys are doing, what's happening in the private sector is really exciting. No government has enough money to do this. Let me be clear. When I left as Secretary of State, it was just clear as hell to me because I was traveling the world and presidents and finance ministers would say to me, hey, can you help us do this? We don't have the money. I mean, when I was Secretary of State, I think our budget was about 52 billion or so in the State Department. And that was for everything the United States of America does abroad. Every one of our missions, all of our programs, USAID, you name it, whatever. And it's really not appropriate for a country as wealthy as ours and as frankly important in terms of technology and innovation and values and standing up for things to be as crippled as we are right now in our ability to be able to do the things that are necessary for the planet. And so health programs in various parts of the world, our leverage and ability to help get the right decisions in certain countries, get people to have better governance. I mean, how do you go tell a country, hey, we think you got to reform and have a little more transparency and accountability in your deal making so we can bring more capital here. We talk about our democracy, and they look at us and they scratch their heads and say, well, how's your democracy working these days? It's hard. Governing is really hard right now, harder than I think it's ever been that I can remember. And so we need to we got to change that. But I don't think the United States' word is scrupulous as long as we follow through, as long as we do the things. And the IRA, I think, was a really important reconnection on credibility, but also the other things we're doing. We just announced $3 billion for the Green Climate Fund. We are now judged by the OECD to have actually, that famous 100 billion, where's the 100 billion? You guys promised 100 billion back in Paris. Well, we've done it. And by the way, we did it last year, not this year. 2022 is judged to have had the 100 billion. This year we'll have it. President Biden has put a $12 billion adaptation program, $3 billion a year for the next years. We're up to 9 something and getting, we're moving. And despite these handicaps that we have, when I was in the Senate, I was there for 28 years, we'd go out to dinner together and we'd talk, Republican, Democrat, and you had a lot of fun. And, you could have a bottle of wine and laugh and tell jokes. And I remember going over to Teddy Kennedy's house and Orrin Hatch would be there. And John Warner from Virginia and Mac Mathias from Maryland. And we go back to the Senate and get something done. Doesn't happen today. Everybody's running around chasing money.
How can that be changed?
How
do you change that? That toxic.
Well, the best thing that could happen in the world would be for the Supreme Court, which won't happen right now, of the United States, to recognize that Citizens United has unleashed dark money and corrupt money and unbelievable amounts of money, and it's freezing the capacity for really good things to happen. The status quo is winning that part of the battle.
On that note.
Does that make you feel better?
It makes me feel great.
Look, I have to tell you, I'm an inveterate optimist. Who was it who said, or Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government in the world, except for everything else.
Right.
And there's a diplomat who...
You say the same about COP as well, actually.
There's a diplomat who came to the United States, and the diplomat from another part of the world, I won't mention where, was asked, what do you think of democracy? And he said, well, democracy is like sex. When it is good, it is very, very good. And when it is bad, it is still quite good.
Secretary Kerry. Thank you. Good.
was a pretty amazing session talking about politics. I'm now delighted to be joined by Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates. Ray, you see the world very clearly. You write about the world. You understand some of the forces at play. And the way you view the world is, at the moment, it's probably volatile. But there are 5 forces at play. And one of them is politics, which Secretary Kerry was talking about. Can you talk about those 5 forces and whether you worry that they're getting even harder to control?
Thank you for the question. Yeah. For the last 50 years, been a practical global macro investor. And some of the things that I learned along the way was that things that surprised me often never happened to me in my lifetime, but happened in history. And there were 3 big forces that led me to study the last 500 years of history and the patterns of history. And those 3 forces were the amount of debt that we're creating, the governments particularly, and the amount of money printing and so on to finance that debt. It's unprecedented other than if you went back to the 1930 to 45 period. The second is the internal divisions, the largest wealth gaps and values gaps that are leading to populism of the left and populism of the right, which a populist is an individual who will fight and win at all cost for that side, it's a threat to the system. And so we have our political that is totally different than at any time in my lifetime. And the third is the geopolitical, the great power conflict. 1945, we began the New World Order. And this pattern always happens. You have a war. The winners of the war set the rules. The United States had half the world economy, 90% of world's money, and all that. And so the world order is changing, competitions, different sides, more risk for conflict. So then when I studied history, I found that the 4th influence, and I'm just in no particular order listing them, the 4th influence was droughts, floods, and pandemics that has actually killed more people and has had a bigger effect in toppling orders, domestic orders and world orders, than the first 3 of those. So, and then number 5, is technology. Throughout history, man's inventiveness and the development of technology. And I saw how they are interrelated in creating these cycles, these big cycles. Because if you spend more money than you earn and you get into debt, that money issue matters. And that's certainly the case now. And then as we look at the next year, certainly populism, and most importantly, perhaps even the threat to our ability to make decisions together, as Secretary Kerry referred to, that political issue is of paramount importance. Number 3, certainly the geopolitical. And as we're dealing with the climate issue, I mean, never in our lifetimes have we had a bigger decision pertaining to climate and its consequences. And then, of course, technology.
You could be quite positive on technology. The other 4 are getting worse. Have we ever seen a more uncertain time for our livelihoods?
Not in our lifetimes. This is analogous to the 1930 to 45 period, and in other periods of time when there's a confluence of these. Because let's think, for example, on the climate issue. It's estimated that between $5 and $10 trillion a year is one way or another. No matter if you neglect it, you'll pay the price. If you don't neglect it, you'll have the cost. Either way, it's going to be $5 to $10 trillion a year. That's world GDP is $100 trillion. So it's expensive. And so we are living in a world that really doesn't have enough money. So even if we're fiddling around with, like, how's this going to work from the money point of view? You have to look at who has the money and what are their motivations. If you want to talk about that, we can, but there's a big money issue here. Money represents productivity. It's a proxy for productivity.
So who does have the money, and what is their motivation?
Okay. I'm going to start with the multilateral development banks have about $2 trillion, and they have responsibility. So in other words, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, have about $2 trillion. That's how much they have, and we have to spend $5 to $10 trillion a year.
philanthropists have about $1 trillion a year worldwide, about 500 in the United States. Not much, a drop in the bucket. The biggest pool of money, is large institutional money, about 200 trillion. That's the big pot of money. Right now, about 0.3% of that money goes into climate and also various forms of, let's say, ecological or investments of that sort. Only about 0.3. I know those people. I know the circumstances. Everybody has to take care of the monies for taking care of who the money's to take care of. And so they have to have a return on that money. And there's a greater possibility to make great money go into these initiatives if they can make it profitable. Profit is a proxy for productivity. And one of the great things about this conference that probably people really don't have a good sense for, that I was lucky to have a good sense for because of some of the things I do, in oceans and so on, is there are so many deals going on.
Right.
We're at a turning point, but the answer is you have to make it profitable. You just can't say it's a good thing, go do it. Regulations matter, of course. There are other things, that politics matter a lot. But in order to really turn it loose, it's the creativity that then gets reinforced, because there has to be a financial sustainability, just like there has to be an ecological sustainability.
But, right, if we go back to the 5 forces, so which one is actually the one that holds back investors? We saw the Inflation Reduction Act, which means that some of these prices for technology is going down. So it's easier to make a profit if you invest it in the right project.
It's the profit. It's the money thing. If it is the biggest influence, we're right now. Let's see what Bill Gates is doing with breakthrough energy. That's such a good example of a double bottom line. Now, you need double bottom line. And that's why some of these deals that are happening, that will never make the headlines. There's 80,000 people here or so, and there's so many deals that are going on. Those are very, very powerful.
We heard this announcement of Altera. I mean, that's a lot of money from the UAE going to funds in Brookfield. Is that a template of how money can be transferred to projects that need it?
It's a wonderful template. And now that has to be converted into profits, but there's so much inventiveness that's happening now that I think that's where the biggest change. Of course, there are questions. There are questions like you could put on a carbon tax, or you could reduce subsidies for carbon, but those are politically problem. So that we got a politics issue too, So I think if you're going to make that move, I think that the other aspect of it is, let's be realistic. We are unlikely to achieve the 1.5 target. So there are 3 things. What you can do to achieve the 1.5 target. The second is adaptation. Okay, if you don't achieve the 1.5 target, what needs to be done to make that acceptable? Of course, the consequences of not doing that are big. Big migration, all sorts of problems. But how do you adapt? And then the third cost is the cost of the damage. I believe that we're going to be moving in an economic way to adaptation, and that there's a lot of, that'll have a great power. And the reason is it affects everybody. So whereas there's an element here of let's be good and get the money. But if you go to, let's say, banks, they say banks have a lot of money, but banks have assets and liabilities. And if they don't receive or give their depositors or those who are putting money with them an adequate amount of return, they won't have any money.
Right.
So you still have to have the return component of that. What happens is self-interest is a great motivator when you have that. And I think adaptation will be some area for probably great investment and great productivity.
But Ray, isn't climate change the biggest risk really to any company? And so when do we see regulation that forces every company to look at it as the longest, biggest risk out there?
Well, I think Secretary Kerry did such a wonderful job of describing the realities of that. I mean, I think that's the balance. And so as a very practical person, one can't say it's going to be all or none. One has to look at actually what is it, what is happening. And I think as you're dealing with the regulation, that's right, that's good. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a meme developing that you're not a good citizen. Mm-hmm. Okay, that political aspect also plays, social aspect, meme, plays a role. Are you doing it well? Is a social pressure that has a role. So there's regulation, there's social pressure. Those are all good things that are helping. The real question is that enough? I mean, it's not like you have them or you don't have them.
No. I mean, and we also have central banks that have gone from 0 interest rates to 5%. So does that make a lot of these projects be more difficult to get off the ground because you can't issue debt to finance projects that are needed in climate change?
But it's a reality. We have to deal with the intersection of the various realities, right?
Yeah.
So let's say from a central bank point of view, what they did was they gave away money. They made interest rates more negative, and you didn't have to pay back principal because they had interest-only loans. So you got money. And then, but the problem is one man's debt is another man's assets. And if you don't create an asset that is going to give you a return that's above inflation, you create a skew. So everybody borrowed a lot of money that is a problem, okay? So when we're dealing with the other question, is it more difficult to finance now that you might have an 8% essentially cost of funds rather than free money? Yes, it is. So what are you going to do about it? You can't not take care of the fact that you need to give them a real return, otherwise you create this bubble that'll blow up. And the debt, sure, we could produce a lot more debt. The government, we could say the government can give us money. Okay, everybody says the government should give us money or protect risks, but there are costs to that. So these all have to interact. You're optimizing for all the parts of this, the machine.
I can't tell whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about climate finance. I mean, when are we going to see real returns?
I'm realistic and practical, I hope, okay?
So how quickly can we see real returns for investors to make a real difference?
I think you're going to see a very rapid growth in profitable, in all sorts of forms. And however, I think it'll come too late and too small to be the solution to that. So I think when we look at the whole climate, the whole thing, I think this COP is going to produce 2 or 3 times more than any COP has produced. And I think we're going to also walk away that it's only 1/3 of what we need to produce in order to deal with that issue. And that's just the reality. So it's like the glass that's 1/3 full or half full. We're going to look at it and it's going to say, is it a success or a failure? It depends on what you're looking at. A lot of great stuff is happening in terms of having impact, but is it enough? No, it's not enough.
Is the US election next year the most important thing for climate change?
It's the most important thing for the world, probably, okay? Because for climate change, of course, it has, I think Secretary Kerry said it very well. There's a world movement, but US leadership and US policy and trade and cooperation is fundamental for climate, and it's fundamental for a world that works well. And we have really a choice about that. So there are going to be issues regarding cooperation. For example, I think Donald Trump's position is that we will have tariffs of about 10% across the board, imports, okay? So we'll become, others will respond with similar things. That makes more of a trade war. And then when you have the trade war, you have more capital wars. And you have less cooperation as you have not a policy, that is a policy of, make America, focus on America, making it great and strong, as he would say. Okay, you have that not lending itself to as much the common interests and the common cooperation. So you have a world government that works more like the US government works now, or doesn't work.
So how do you see it playing out? Is it too soon?
I think a lot will have to do with the primaries. Okay, so we'll go through the politics. The game plan of Republicans who don't want Donald Trump to be elected is that there'll be the 3 primaries, or the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire, and then South Carolina, and the candidates who are not number 1 opponent of them should drop out, and then there'll be 1 candidate. I would say it looks like most likely Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley is somebody who I think you have to work across party lines. You have to be smart, you have to work across party lines. I'm in favor of a system that has those type of people on both sides. I think you need a strong middle, and that strong middle of those who can work across party lines also has to have reforms. There will need to be a lot of reforms that take place that make the country be able to deal with its challenges and do well. And so in the primary, I think the primary, who gets the nomination, is going to be the most important election. And if you get an opponent, let's say whoever that opponent would be, let's say Nikki Haley by way of example, that affects the Democratic side, because there's a question. Most Americans don't want a Biden-Trump election. And most of them don't want either, for each their various reasons. There are reasons of age and so on that enter into that. And so there's even consideration within the Democratic Party. Will that happen or will it won't? It's likely that if that alternative, let's say it's Nikki Haley, was to run, it would be likely that she would win the presidential election. That's what the polls would show. That puts the Democrats in a position where, okay, now the choice becomes a little bit more difficult. So the question of who is running against whom in the election also carries forward to whether you have a system that works well. Because if you have the polarity of the extreme, neither side can win. There will not be an acceptance of some of the policies. The policies even include how opposition is being dealt with. So that you have irreconcilable differences. So yes, the election is going to be critically important for not just the United States, for the world.
And what will the American economy look like?
I'm sorry?
What will the American economy look like when people go to the votes?
Well, there'll be, it's a very, no, the American economy will be softening, okay, because what kept it what's relatively strong is there was a big transfer of wealth from the government. The government got much more in debt. Central banks bought the debt by printing money. We had an inflation piece. They put out more money, about twice as much money as was necessary to compensate for the COVID losses. So everybody got a lot of money and the government got a lot into debt. That is now going down. And the household and business sector's balance sheets and income statements are relatively good. But at the same time, as that goes down, then you're having also the debt mature and roll over. So higher interest rates enter into the picture of what a new funding is, and you referred to it earlier in your question. Oh, at this interest rate, it's a whole different story. And all of that is favoring then the weakening of the economy. I don't think there's going to be a big bust or anything, not financial crisis, but it's not going to be a strong economy. And a lot has to have do with also the supply-demand of bonds, which is a whole other subject. So I would expect that there's going to be, I don't think there's going to be economic happiness. Right. And because there's not going to be economic happiness, as that plays a role on the election, it will mean that the party in power is going to have more challenges. Yep. Plus, at the same time, there is the age question, and things then the succession to President Biden, and that issue, and who's going to choose the successor. Is that going to be the public, or is that going to be Biden? And all of those issues come together to make an interesting election.
So it certainly will. We're almost out of time, but what does that mean for raising finance for climate projects next year?
If the entrepreneurship is good, and it really is good, as I said earlier, you're going to see a lot more, but it's going to be difficult, and it will not be the game changer.
Ray Dalio, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Peter Bachman, Managing Director of Sustainable Infrastructure at Gresham House and Senior Associate at the University of Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, Alexandra Holmand, CEO of Carlbo Natural Asset Company, and Ramzi Issa, Managing Director of UBS, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Natasha White.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, there will be a Q&A. We'll try to make time for a brief Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions that arise during the panel, please submit them via the QR code, which you should see on the screen just up there. So we've just been hearing about the financial implications of climate change, and we're going to turn now to a slightly different but deeply interconnected problem of nature loss. We're seeing a record loss of biodiversity in almost every single country in the world, and climate change is both a driver of and driven by that loss. This time last year, over 190 countries signed a pact that's been dubbed the Paris Agreement for Nature, and that pinpointed a funding gap of over $700 billion per year by 2030. But those flows have failed to materialize. I'm joined today by three individuals who are doing something fairly rare and tangible in this space. They are investing in, so they are making returns from, nature restoration. We've got Peter, who's an investor, Ramzi, who's an investment banker, and Alexandra in the middle, who's written a PhD on how to finance nature protection and has since set up a company doing just that. Alexandra and Peter are in the business of biodiversity credits, and I expect you're all familiar with carbon credits, but biodiversity credits are something a little bit different. These are tradable units of biodiversity uplift. So for example, you buy a piece of land, you change the way in which it's managed, and you measure the difference from A to B against a predefined metric. And it's that then gets packaged, that number that is thrown up there that gets packaged into a biodiversity credit. And that can be sold to companies who either want to make a positive contribution to nature or to offset their harm to nature. And that's a kind of somewhat controversial distinction. There's a debate going around that in this space, which we'll turn to. But first, Alexandra, please could you tell us a bit about what you're doing and how you're creating biodiversity credits?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. I just have to make a small correction. I have not yet written a PhD.
Okay.
I'm still working on it.
Still good.
But I'm a CEO of Carlbo Natural Asset Company, and we are owned by Mr. Connie Johnson and his family. Mr. Connie Johnson is the founder of EQT. Some people may know of him. And our job is to make returns, attractive returns from nature-positive forestry, which we do in order to create positive biodiversity outcome alongside sustainable wood production. So that is what we do. And I got into this through my research and my previous experience in forestry investments. So we are applying the methods that we developed through the research on various geographies and ecosystems.
Okay, and Peter, you're investing in a type of project developer or market intermediary in the compliance of the regulated market in England, which will enter into force into January. What has made that an investable proposition for you there?
Yeah, well, firstly, can I just say what a great warm-up act for nature, John Kerry and Ray Dalio. I think that's amazing. But I mean, before I start, like for me, the why is also what nature can do. Like if we do nature-based solutions on a global basis, we could get 10 gigatons worth of CO2 savings. You know, this COP has been about renewables. That's equivalent to 44,000 gigawatts worth of renewables, or the emissions of the US, the EU, and Japan combined. So that's why we care about biodiversity and the power it can actually have to help us reach net zero. In terms of how we've invested in it, we've got two strands. So one is, as Natasha talked about, the compliance market. So in the UK, for all of its faults, it's created what we think is a landmark piece of legislation called the Environment Act, which for the first time has put an economic value on nature. You know, this is incredible because what you need to do now, if you're in the UK, you want to get planning permission, so permission to build something significant, you need to improve the biodiversity by at least 10%. That might not sound very hard, but if you've got a greenfield site and you want to turn it into an Amazon warehouse full of concrete, that's tough. So what we've done is created an off-site mechanism where we're taking non-productive land, so this is not food-grade land, this is stuff that you can't really do much with, and we turn it into these woodlands, wetlands, species-rich mosaics of biodiversity that create a huge amount of impact for the planet. And what we can do, therefore, is create a value whereby these developers can either do it on-site, which means they need to give up developable land, or they do it off-site with what we're doing within the local planning area, and we're able to sell that to those developers, and we create a financial return, which we think is quite attractive. And we've structured a mechanism whereby we're investing our funds, and we've now created a dedicated vehicle to invest solely into this biodiversity strategy. And we've got investors like WTW or Willis Towers Watson in there as well, investing in this today. So this is an investable proposition that we're doing something with today. The other strand that we follow is what we call the voluntary market. So actually, we think there's a lot of corporates that want to become nature positive. There's a lot of companies in the UK, for example, that have said they want to become nature positive soon. And what we've created is a mechanism whereby we've created these huge projects. So we've got our first landmark project in the north of Norfolk called the Wolferton Project, where we're taking land to effectively connect up the Norfolk coast with a series of wetland mosaics to farmland that would otherwise not be very productive. So this is a mechanism where we're creating a huge amount of improvements to the soil quality, flood defense, but importantly, biodiversity uplifts that we can measure. So we do a baseline survey, and we expect to see about a 20x increase in species diversity, and we also expect to see a 5x improvement in important birds, as an example. So, you know, we think we can create a nature-positive mechanism, it's all measured and monitored, and we can sell that to corporates who want to become nature-positive, and that's something we've invested in today as well.
And just to kind of put a number on the value of these credits, when in the voluntary carbon market, we're talking about kind of, I think the average is around $10 per credit. In the biodiversity, the compliance market in England, Peter was just telling me that these are going for anything from $30,000 a credit to $2 million a credit. And that kind of ranges from grassland to kind of complex wetlands that you're restoring. So the multiples are huge there. And Peter and Alexandra, you've both just mentioned nature positive. Could you perhaps explain, Alexandra, maybe in your role at the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, which is a standards body around this market, what nature positive means and how that's distinct from the kind of net concept that we're familiar with in the climate world?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very important one. The way we think about it is that you need to do whatever you can to minimize the negative impacts of your operations first and foremost, before you can think of buying into biodiversity credits, for example. So getting net kind of zero negative impact is the step one companies should take, including ourselves when we do forestry operations. But to create the positive uplift can be only done when you've kind of swept in front of your own door.
So there's a role for both offsets to get to the net level, and then credits to become a positive.
I'm not sure offsets. I'm not working with offsets. I think both offsets and voluntary biodiversity credits do have a place, but I think before all, you can use offsets to get to the net zero, and then possibly biodiversity credits to get to the net positive level. But first of all, to minimize the negative impacts.
Yeah, Okay.
Can I just go one step further? So we've done a huge amount to destroy our biodiversity. So in the UK, for example, we're in the bottom 10% globally in terms of biodiversity intactness. And if we just look at protect, that's not going to get us above to where we need to. You know, we need to be doing enhance and restore to really try to get back the planet to where it needs to be. So Nature Positive is doing a really, really large positive step to try to replace and improve what has been taken away. So it's a lot more than just an offset type mechanism.
Okay. I think we can come back to that, but I want to come now to Ramzi, who's doing something a bit different. Ramzi has played a pioneering role in structuring debt for nature swaps. So these are deals that have been around since the 80s, but Ramzi has structured them originally at Credit Suisse and he's now at UBS in a way that's made them attractive to institutional investors, so pension funds that wouldn't normally invest in places or projects that we're talking about here, through a kind of blended finance approach, which has been hot on everyone's lips this week at COP28. So Ramzi, could you tell us a bit about how you did that, perhaps the blended aspect?
So first of all, thank you for, for having me here. So just maybe a little bit of background for those that are unfamiliar with how the transactions work. So high level, debt swaps is a financing mechanism to fund SDGs. That's kind of the first step.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Sustainable Development Goals, thank you. And the twist that we do here is that funding for development, for developing economies is done through debt savings rather than additional or new debt. So at CS, we did the first 3 transactions in the market, and then for context for people in the room. So we executed transactions for the first one in Belize, Barbados, and most recently in Ecuador. We refinanced about $2.3 billion of their debt that generated about $700 million for ocean conservation and $1.2 billion of additional debt savings on top of that. So one of the things that we, for these transactions to work, they have kind of 2 key, I'd say, parties involved, a part obviously from the investors. So the first is we work very closely with NGOs, particularly in these transactions. We worked with the Nature Conservancy and the Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy. So that's kind of a very key part of the transaction for institutional investors, because they want to have credible and high quality implementing partners to not only select the projects based on sound scientific reasons, but also to ensure that the funding gets deployed and also is monitored. So that's the kind of the first key condition, and then the kind of the second key condition is the work with development finance institutions. So in the transactions that we've executed so far, we've worked with the DFC and the IADB, and let's say that the financing mechanism relies on the debt savings, as I mentioned earlier, which is realized through the credit enhancement that these institutions play. But that's not the only role that they play in the transactions which are relevant to the institutional investors, because you can get some of that credit enhancement through the private markets. But the other kind of key role that they have in the transaction is more of a stabilizing role, which then allows us to not only get the credit enhancement, but also to be able to term out the debt for developing countries, which is important from a policy point of view. So effectively what the countries are able to do is to lock in cheaper debt and repay it over a longer term period, which all else equal should mean that their economies should be a bit more resilient to global economic shocks like the pandemic, for example, a few years ago.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, as you can hear, they're quite complex transactions. They're buying, these countries are being helped to buy back debt from the bond markets. They then reissue new debt, which is cheaper with a longer maturity, and the savings from that are freed up for nature conservation projects.
Right.
And when you listen to Peter and Alexandra talk about their work on biodiversity credits, what's going through your mind there? How do you see opportunities, and what's the linkages between what Alexandra and Peter are doing and what you're doing with your work?
Yeah, so again, from a 10,000-foot view, these transactions ultimately in the first step are meant to finance hard-to-finance projects, right? So, and from a financial point of view, those are projects that don't necessarily, in the first order, generate revenues to cover the cost of debt. And that's why we're relying on reduction of debt to free up budget capacity to be able to redeploy that into the marine conservation and the deals that we've done. But I think some of the work that's being done on the biodiversity credit, for me, when we talk to some of the sovereigns, we say nature protection is not just a first step, and it's not mutually exclusive from not generating new revenues, right? So I think some of the work that Alexandra is doing is the kind of the step to kind of continue, or the bridge that can continue to say, well, the first you've successfully protected nature, you've created some sustainable financing mechanism to do that, and now there is a potential revenue source from doing that activity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I want to turn now to kind of this skepticism that has surfaced in relation to the biodiversity credits or offsets market. So obviously the carbon markets have had a troubling couple of years around carbon accounting, but also getting money to people on the ground who's really doing the difference there. Could you talk, Alexandra, a bit about the work that you're doing to address those problems with biodiversity credits, including how you can make nature fungible? So obviously swapping a giraffe in Kenya for a forest in Sweden or the UK is a challenging task, to say the least. What are you doing to put the standards in place in the market to address those issues?
Well, I can speak of the experience that we've been involved in the transaction between a private forest owner, a big forest area in Sweden, and Swedbank, one of the major banks in Sweden. This was part of the research project to begin with, and we wanted to test whether the crediting methodology we developed actually works in practice and if there is any market interest in it. Turns out there is market interest in this, but of course a lot of questions about how does it work, how can we follow it up, and there are a lot of things that are not in place yet, like there is no global standard for biodiversity credits. There are a lot of emerging methodologies, et cetera, But the way we address this is that we have involved Swedbank in this case from the beginning to the end throughout the project, and we're totally transparent with the financial side of it, the costs of the project, etc. So they were involved all the time, and the forest owner luckily was willing to put forward some of the land that they're managing into this project. And basically, the long story short, we could prove that the crediting methodology does work, in this case in production forest landscapes, which, by the way, is a huge opportunity to scale and to provide less risky investment, so to speak, into biodiversity. And that I think that investors might like it. It's biodiversity uplift at lower risk.
Yeah, and Peter, can I get your response as well to that, including this point around whether it's productive land or unproductive land, which is something that you alluded to at the beginning?
Yeah, so I guess just in terms of the biodiversity carbon credit thing, I think carbon has gone to a race to the bottom in terms of integrity, and I think where the voluntary biodiversity market needs to be is a race to the top in terms of real ecological integrity. So I think that's the bedrock, and I think biodiversity is not fungible like carbon. So first and foremost, it's proximate to where it needs to be. It needs to be replacing the type of biodiversity that's been taken away in the first place. But we've got this business, the Environment Bank, and we've got 70 of the best ecologists and land management specialists in the world, and they actually tell me governance and fully funded, or like being fully funded, is almost as important as the ecology aspect as well. So where we see this market going is really, we're not sure what standard is going to apply to it, but you need to have absolute ecological integrity. You need to ensure that it's funded so you actually get to the end result, because a lot of projects in the carbon market never got to the finish line. And then ultimately, they need to be governed in a way that you can be sure that they're going to be operated in the right way. You have the right mechanisms to step in if people aren't doing the right things along the way. So I think this is an evolving space. I think this is a great chance for corporates that want to do this to be bold and to become, we're trying to create nature shares where it's actually not a credit, it's actually you're being part, you've got an asset that's increasing in value every year in terms of defined biodiversity outcomes. So there's some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of trying to create the integrity that we need for this market to scale properly.
Okay, we've got just under 5 minutes left. I wanted to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. All right. I'm just going to go through these, see what we've got. Biodiversity is site-specific. One cannot use a credit from anywhere given site-specific rare flora. How can biodiversity credits overcome this challenge?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I can answer to that. It's very difficult. I think, actually doing research in this space, I can say that you do need a PhD to understand biodiversity assessments. It is very, very complicated, and it's true. Biodiversity looks different from place to place. But we can agree on certain frameworks that can be applied anywhere in the world. And therefore, I think there is an opportunity to create a global standard if we want to. But then we need to have local applications. And I think there is a lot of discussion today about different types of remote sensing and opportunities in measuring biodiversity by satellites. And I think definitely that's the future. However, at this point in time, it does not provide enough granularity on the ground. So you need to combine, people doing the inventory on foot with the satellite data to get proper data.
Yeah, I'd just say in the UK government, they've got this thing called the DEFRA metric. So the government department that manages the rural economy does try to put a relative value on biodiversity, and it is trying to get over some of those challenges. And so there is a scientific way to sort of bridge the gap a little bit. Yeah. But it's not perfect. You still can't take a woodland and turn it into grassland and expect that they're going to be like for like. It is quite specific, and it's regionally important as well.
Great. I will add the commentary from this one so that you get the compliment. Could I ask our excellent panelists about velocity? As positive as debt for nature swaps are, it appears to take a long time for those dollars to be put to work for shovel-ready projects. Why are these debt solutions not more rolled into larger blended structures to bring in additional private investors?
Okay, so thank you. So I can take that one. So I think when people kind of see the end product, it seems like that it's a fairly kind of straightforward exercise, but what happens actually leading up to that is that there's a lot of research that goes into an engagement in the local community to identify what is exactly kind of key projects to focus on. So I think to simply answer that is that I think there is a lot of scientific work that's being done to kind of prepare and give the rationale of why they need funding to begin with. So it's not just about announcing some lofty goals. It's saying if we target these type of KPIs or these types of projects, all else equal, we should expect that the project should have the impact that all the parties are working hard towards to obtain.
Right. But there was an announcement yesterday, wasn't there, from multilateral development banks that you see as potentially helping to scale these deals?
Yeah. So I think helping to definitely to scale, because now there are about 8 development finance institutions now that have signed together a joint statement, 6 of which are new. So I think it helps to some extent, obviously, bring in some more capital because you have more credit enhancement providers in the development finance world. But also I think it's some form of validation, I think, for the transactions themselves, that they see that they actually have incremental impact, and to have a bit of patience that these deals, it's not in financial markets timeline. These are kind of real world projects. But I think now we have 6 new DFIs who have raised their hands to say, we want to participate in this market because we think it actually leads to to real impact. So I think it's also a validation of the financing structure that we helped set up.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, I think we're just about at time. So I want to thank my wonderful panelists today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The relationship between tourism and nature has always been a very important relationship, but unfortunately it has been always a negative relationship where one is thriving over the other. What Red Sea Global is trying to do is have a very different approach. We believe that tourism does stand a very good chance as an industry to be the role model, to demonstrate to the world how things can be done differently.
Please welcome to the stage John Pagano, Group CEO of Red Sea Global, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Anne Kavalerski.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for being here, John.
Good morning.
We have a bit to get through, so we'll just kind of dive right in. There's a lot to talk about, and I know we want to really level set on sustainability versus regenerative, so we'll just kind of get right into it there. John, many people may have heard you talk about regenerative tourism over the last 6 or so years. I think we should start and sort of level set here with what does that approach mean in practice? If you could share a little bit about that. And how does it differ from being sort of merely sustainable?
Well, look, yeah, so when we did start our journey 6 years ago, we did talk about setting new standards in sustainability. And as we got deeper into our sort of analysis of the destination and what we were planning to do, it sort of struck me that, sustainability is maintaining the status quo. And I guess we reached the conclusion that it's no longer enough. Unless we take decisive action to change the course that we're on, the future doesn't look terribly bright. So we started focusing on regeneration. And so what does that mean in practice? It means in practice actually trying to proactively make the place better than when you actually found it. So we set ourselves some very ambitious goals in order to achieve that.
Wonderful. And as you mentioned there, sort of the point of view on sustainability, sort of maintaining status quo. If we think about measuring success for sustainability, for example, you're pushing that. You're going further than that with regenerative. So how can destinations really demonstrate that they are regenerative versus sustainable?
Okay, so I neglected to mention the ambitious goal that we set ourselves. So instead of maintaining the status quo, we set ourselves the ambition of setting an increase in net conservation value of our entire destination by 30% by 2040. In practice, that means increasing biodiversity, increasing corals, mangroves, etc. Now, we're dealing with a skeptical world today. Nobody's quite sure what to believe. You look at social media and everybody's like, is it true, is it not true? So we're going to let data dictate and demonstrate our accomplishments against that goal. So we've undertaken one of the largest baseline surveys ever undertaken by a private developer in the world. And not for our own benefit, but we actually publish it. And against that baseline, we will measure our progress. Now, we've set ourselves lofty targets, and we will report whether we have success or failure. But even getting close to our targets, I would argue, is success. And that's how we're going to ultimately validate what we're doing.
Amazing. So moving beyond sort of the definition and the concept of regenerative and sort of measuring that, want to talk a little bit about tourism in the space. Mm-hmm. So beyond that idea of rhetoric, what does meaningful climate and biodiversity action in tourism look like?
Well, like I said, I think, and again, it's appropriate that we're at COP28. There's been a lot of talk, and we're about action. It is now time for action, and so we set out 6 years ago to build the largest destination in the world, tourism destination in the world, powered by renewable energy 24 hours a day. And I can tell you today, we've done that. We've installed 760,000 photovoltaic panels at the Red Sea. We've built the largest battery storage system in the world to date. And to me, that's success. We've planted 1 million mangrove trees, and I've got an abundance of mangroves. We're growing corals. We're about to launch a marine protected area to help build fish biodiversity and build back stocks. That's what regenerative development is all about, regenerative tourism.
Amazing. And do you think that that could be a framework that's applied more broadly? Or do you see this being very sort of local in its conception and execution?
No, look, we're very fortunate in Saudi Arabia and at the Red Sea in particular to have a supportive leadership and government and ultimately a very patient shareholder. We're using what we're doing in Saudi Arabia not just for the benefit of Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea, but also as a platform to really lead a transition towards a different way to develop. So we hope that by our actions, others will follow us. And I think as we discussed before we started, the consumers are going to drive this transition. We're showing it can be done. We're demonstrating that it can be done. Consumers are going to demand choices that they can travel more sustainably. And survey after survey, we're seeing that they are interested in finding sustainable options. They're willing to pay more. So as a developer, you can make that incremental investment knowing in the full knowledge that eventually you will get a return on that investment. And if you don't do it, I suspect that consumers will vote with their wallet and not actually come and visit your destination and would prefer to come to Red Sea.
I think one of the interesting things in talking to you earlier about regenerative versus sustainable is the idea of sort of the local nuances of a travel experience, right? So the context of which you're traveling in, the communities, the culture. Can you talk a little bit about how that's a factor and how you think about this? And even when you're thinking about sort of the framework for deployment, how that comes into action?
Sure. Look, we're obviously very much focused on environment and climate because that's the subject of this event and also COP. But what's equally important to us is the social aspects of it. We're working within local communities and we're empowering local communities. We're creating opportunities for local communities, creating new jobs. So we're spending huge amounts of money on upskilling young Saudis to embrace this new tourism industry that is evolving in the country. We have 200 students studying international hospitality management for which we provided scholarships. But more than that, we've got upwards of 10,000 vocational positions that we're now training for. The first 430 of which graduated in July of this year, all of whom are now working for us directly or for our partners, be it our hotel operators, the airport, and so on. So it's creating those opportunities. We've created one of the largest farming co-ops in Saudi Arabia to help teach local farmers sustainable farming techniques and giving them a market to sell their goods to. We're going to be a big consumer of produce, and so if we can buy locally, we support the local economy, we reduce our food miles, it's sort of a win-win situation for us.
Speaking of education, there's a common perception that regenerative tourism is inherently more expensive than traditional sustainable tourism. If you could talk a little bit about that, and is that a valid assumption or is that a misperception?
It's a valid assumption today because we're pioneering, we're doing things that others haven't done. But by us doing it, we demonstrate that it can be done, and we hope that others will follow. The more adoption there is over time, the lower the cost will be. As I said before, consumers are willing today to pay a little bit more to travel sustainably. So I think it'll ultimately come good. But I'll give you the example of photovoltaic panels to generate solar energy. When they were first introduced, they were super expensive. Governments had to subsidize to a great extent. Today, they are the cheapest form of energy that you can actually source. So it's cheaper than producing power by using coal. So that's the beauty of adoption and scale. And so what we hope we're going to accomplish is by demonstrating that it can be done with more people taking our lead, the cost will come back down and be more equitable towards a sustainable tourism rather than regenerative tourism. But somebody has to be first. And as I said, we can talk about doing stuff. We want to do it because unless somebody does it, we're going to sit around looking at each other. So who's going to go first? So we decided to take that initial leap.
So Red Sea and you are doing a lot. We talked about power, mangroves, coral, education, communities. There's a lot there. How are you managing all of this, John? How are you guys kind of doing all this at the same time and thinking through that process?
I'm blessed with a very capable team. I mean, we're 5,000 strong today. We started 6 years ago as a startup company. We're over 5,000 people. passionate, professional believers in what we're doing. They're committed to the environment, they're committed to Saudi Arabia, they're committed to upskilling and creating new opportunities, life-changing opportunities for many. So very fortunate in that regard.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you so much for being here and for educating us in regenerative tourism.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Please welcome to the stage Joyce Mendez and Issa Siddiqa, members of the UN Secretary-General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabasaja.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for being here. I know it's been busy COP for you both, but this is not your first rodeo, so you're used to this. I just wanted to start with the fact that, from my perspective, since I was at the blue zone and the green zone the past few days, it feels like a different COP to me. And I wanted to know from both of your perspectives, because you've been to a few now, from the activism movement. I mean, how does it feel for you? Joyce, do you maybe want to start?
Yeah, obviously, like I think, hello everybody, Asia pa, che Rera, hi Joyce, che Aime, Paraguay po, wa Brazil po. So I'm Joyce Mendez, and I'm very excited to be here. And yeah, I think it's been massive. Obviously, we know about this. Representativity has increased in many ways. And also I think that every time, this is my 5th COP, I feel that also not as a youth person, but also as a professional in the energy, water, and food nexus. I think, like, obviously conversations are being more critical, and like people are also more aware about like really what are the targets, where do we have to get at. Unfortunately, some governments, especially some of my countries, they haven't been kind of that aware about the limit, the 1.5. So I'm a little bit still concerned, yeah.
What about you, Issa?
Good afternoon, everybody. I feel like the energy in the room is a little down.
Let's bring it up.
Yeah, let's bring it up. I am called Issa Siddiqa. I come from the Mochiwala tribe in Pakistan. And to your question on activism at this COP, I don't think it's any different than under the UNFCCC convention. At the UNFCCC convention, one is not allowed to call nation states out. One is not allowed to gather in large numbers. I think the kind of narrowing on the Middle East as a question of how this COP is different, same could be said if this COP was in the United States or if it was in Glasgow, which protest was not permitted either. So I think the question actually isn't on civil society engagement, but rather what are the parties doing? Because the COP fundamentally is about governments coming together to solve the issue of climate change, and I think that is where Joyce and I's expertise lie.
So what then have you made of the progress in some people's mind that we've seen in the first few days of this COP? I mean, are you seeing sort of the discussions and the policy negotiations and decisions sort of where you hope it would be?
No.
Oh.
The answer is no. For many reasons. I think we applauded the first day way too much. The Loss and Damage Fund was established. I think it's good that it was established, but a country like the United States put $15 million into that fund. The total amount of monies, I think, in the Loss and Damage Fund is now $500 million. That is the total salary of 6 Saudi football players. And that is absolutely ridiculous, I think. I'm from Pakistan. Last year, my country experienced floods of no kind. 60 million people were displaced. If the US were to give that $15 million to those 60 million, each person would receive a quarter. that is nothing, especially for countries that are disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis. And then more on climate finance, I think we are seeing a lot of commitments, not just on loss and damage, but generally on the Green Climate Fund. And these commitments are lovely words, but they seldom make it to the pot. So I'm a bit concerned about that.
Yeah. Joyce, jump in, because I heard someone yesterday telling me that all of the flood of pledges and initiatives and announcements that we've been hearing has made it difficult for some activists to be able to get through the noise. I mean, is that how it's been for you? Do you feel like there are a lot of words, as Issa was saying, and not enough actual action?
Yeah, and I also believe that, I agree completely as well with what Issa said. We were actually discussing that with Secretary General about like, when you put that money into perspective, especially when you're talking about as well disaster relief, right? That is not like significantly enough. And I'm also like worried, especially, so where I live is in Paraguay, and it's a country that is, I mean, we're expecting not to have winter soon. I mean, this year we reached 40 Celsius plus during winter. And actually we're experimenting migration, and also, what I see is a different reality as well from what as well my government's coming to say here as well, pledging, and also having this perspective of we are an environmental, powerhouse on what really I live on my daily life. So it also, I think the question it will be back on what you mean, what is activism, right? Because activism has like several perspectives, several ways of acting. For example, we do not protest, or we probably, it's not that we can, but it's not well seen, otherwise they'll close the doors for us. So we have to learn to do policy making, public policies, engage civil society in different ways. So if you mean activism will be like protesting or organizing, I think Issa has the expertise in that way. Unfortunately, we have to learn to be in decision-making places, because it's not, even if you say activism is like a tattoo and people are like afraid. Sometimes like in English you have creative words like advocate and some others, but in Spanish like advocate will be abogado, and like everybody gets confused. So it's been a funny thing, because it's like, okay, you're a professional in the area, you work advising, but at the same time you're a person, you're a young person, you're going to be back into that reality. And I also had to bring something back to my community as well, like tangible. We know this pledge is there, but how that will translate on my community.
Exactly. So then what is proving to be effective then when you're at COP, when you're, there's a number of negotiators from a number of public sector, private sector, of course, right, oil and gas companies. So what is effective from your perspective? What is actually working?
Like
from the activist community?
Well, I think that one is like, people are very aware that we just cannot wait like on that money, like exactly youth. I mean, we see that money, that commitment, but youth and indigenous peoples or other vulnerable communities aren't included into the climate architecture. I mean, we see, for example, I work with electrification projects in the Peruvian Amazon, and it's like for us to apply, even sometimes for a grant, it's a bunch of crazy requirements, and like we don't see as well that distribution. So our reality is like, okay, those negotiations are taking place, but also how we can manage to create partnerships and alliances, during COP. So young people, we don't come here just, take pictures and all of that. No. Action, like we have a heavy responsibility on really making tangible actions back home. Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Issa?
You asked what is working?
Yeah, what's effective?
In the negotiations, actually, one country vetoing something that is working makes the policy go null. So what isn't working is, for the past 3 days, we've had really robust conversations on the global stock take. We've had really robust conversation on the NDCs, but they haven't been formalized. And I think leadership, where I would applaud leadership, is probably the states of Vanuatu, Tuvalu, Tonga, Colombia, and a few countries that are experiencing the climate crisis as a human rights issue. Leadership is working as the Pacific Islands are asking the International Court of Justice to connect climate change to human rights. Leadership is working as Colombia is signing on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Leadership is working as the AOSIS and G77 countries are demanding the implementation of a loss and damage fund. Where it is really, really halted is where countries like the United States, like the UAE, like big emitting nations are halting progress.
Well, where are they halting the most progress, would you say?
Fossil fuel phase out.
The text in particular, is that what?
The text in particular, and also the energy conversation. We don't have an energy agenda at this COP, which is really a big paradox. And simultaneously, this is the biggest COP in terms of attendance that has ever occurred. It's 70,000 people, 140,000 people registered to be in the blue zone, 300,000 people registered to be in the green zone. And although we have a civil society attendance, I think more attendance of media and the private sector that I've ever seen. What is actually at the heart of this is party negotiations. Can you remind me what you asked in particular?
No, I was saying, you know, because you were talking about fossil fuels and the text, that is where the holdup is.
Yeah, the fossil fuel industry is heavily, heavily involved in this COP.
How do you both navigate that then? I mean, you just really outlined, you painted a good picture for what this is. 300,000 people registered for the green zone, the blue zone, 100,000. You said there's a ton of media, there's a number of companies. How do you navigate what you are trying to do, the message you are trying to convey then on the ground?
On the ground back home.
Here.
Here. It's bringing the attention back to actually the outcomes of the COP. It's bringing attention back to nationally determined contributions. At Paris, countries agreed that they would put in place mechanisms to decarbonize by 2023 and then 2025. The global stocktake, it's basically a health test. It's a full body health test that you go to the doctor for, and he tells you your heart's failing, your kidney's failing, you have an appendix problem, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna cut out this, cut out that, and I'm gonna make myself healthy. So it's proper health check. What we're seeing is our health is still horribly bad. And the NDC is where our plan, national contributed distributions those were our plans to get back to health. And the thing is, after the global stocktake is done, there is no mechanism to ensure that there is accountability. And we need accountability, so that is what attention needs to be brought back to. You can acknowledge that you have a health issue. You can say you need to take medicines, but if you don't take them, you don't take them.
How does that affect then your day in, day out? I mean, Joyce, maybe give us some insight into what the next few days look like for you and what the past few days have looked like.
Yeah, so basically, I think as well, as I feel as well that pressure of, bringing tangible solutions again, I have got as well opportunity to, bring youth as well from different community financing and other kind of ways as well, opportunities. So we have kind of different agendas. I mean, I have created several grassroots organizations in Brazil, in Paraguay as well, and contribute with several ones in Latin America. So what we do as well is, COP is as well a platform to highlight certain realities that, they're never mentioned. So for example, when you think Brazil, everybody's like the Amazon, and that's it. There is no more forest. Well, we're in the border, we have, with Argentina and Bolivia, we have the Pantanal forest, and it's been burning a lot the last days. 6 million mammals have been killed in the last week. Nothing in the news, or, even we say like, okay, I lost a colleague. He was born alive, fighting, against the fire. And then, using as well spaces and meetings, like providing, here it is. Let's create a Pantanal fund, like advocating with the Brazilian government. One of my colleagues is 18 years old and he works in the Brazilian parliament, trying to mobilize. So when they think, like youth is like, we put you here, kind of the activism, no, like we are qualifying a lot of the activism because we're gonna be back there. So it's highlighting these realities, but also again, doing alliances, among youth projects, talking as well with ministers, like, hey, this is the reality. Even though sometimes they get uncomfortable, they want to avoid us. They're like, oh, they got too much, information, or like they are listening to it, or like the secretary. Sometimes, we have seen in some cases that even the access, accreditation, for indigenous peoples, or like, activists is like, no, we cannot get party overflows in some, like cases, and because there is like a brand, it's like this is a huge vitrine and everybody wants to sell as well the best in the country, but hey, we are here to work with you. Like, we are occupied in these places, it's our country, we love where we are from, so allow us as well and not put that much resistance, because at the end of the day, again, we're in this reality and those commitments won't be sustainable over time if we are not being trained, included, and especially in Latin America, we are tackling a lot of things, poverty, unemployment, and again, climate justice. And we say activism will not be, like effective if we are not really moving the roots, the critical roots of, the transition, a paradigmatic transition.
So it's giving a lot of these negotiators the reality on the ground, the reality check, essentially, is what
we're trying, right? When they allow us to enter certain spaces as well. And sometimes if they close the door, we just, jump through the window and try to talk to them as well, because...
You jump through the window?
No, I mean...
Proverbial.
Yeah, but in the way that, again, that is one way, We have different other as well methods, communicating, advocating. We're trying again, but it will be as well easier if we have like this inclusion and say, okay, let's work together, instead of being close in the barriers.
How do you continue the momentum that happens here at COP? I mean, I don't doubt that the two of you can continue that and carry it on when you go back home, but I mean, how does the coalition of youth who want to be a part of this continue?
So there's two answers to that.
Yeah.
The first answer to that is the COP is the convening of nation states to basically, the work happens all year around. This is where sorry for all of the analogies, you probably know this already, I'm just yapping away, but the COP is essentially a game, and this is where the scoreboard is revealed. So they've been working year in and year out, and this is where countries come together. The momentum needs to occur when party delegations go home and they've now analyzed and spoken, and then they need to meet their agenda year after year. If we keep extending the deadline on the homework that is due, I mean, if the climate crisis was a homework assignment, we would all be failed and left behind in our schools. We have big fat F on the report card because you can't meet your paper deadlines. You're not executing. So countries, parties, and the global delegations really need to fulfill their homework. Momentum for civil society. I think that's a rather unfortunate, I have a rather unfortunate answer to that. The momentum exists fundamentally because the climate crisis is getting worse. In so many parts of the world, like my colleague Joyce was mentioning, there's fires, there's floods, there's typhoons, hurricanes, disasters. One needs to mobilize, and the momentum occurs, unfortunately, because of the constant threat to life. And I wonder how long, like, what threshold do we need to reach? How much disaster needs to occur, like, until we really change the way that we are addressing this climate crisis? And that's an open question.
Joyce, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, of course. I think in the way, again, I think for us, like action, it translates like trying to mitigate, like what's happening locally. Again, high temperatures, weather crisis, a lot of things at the same time. So obviously, like we are trying and push, like these agendas. And I think, again, we have seen as well, not just representation, but as well engagement. And we have seen some delegations as well, including young people. And it will be amazing if other, delegations can also include young people, not just because it's a checklist, right? Like, oh, youth watching or tokenism, but because we really have a different way of acting. I believe youth, we are catalyst of actions, like in chemistry, catalyst is like a substance that allows you to have a reaction faster. We do, because it's like, we know this is our life and this is urgent, so we work in very innovative ways. And I think the question that I also want to leave the audience, and the question that motivates, and I've been talking with a negotiator, is like, how do you want to be remembered? Like, how are you going to be a good ancestor? How are you going to be a good ancestor? And this is the moment we're showing it.
All right, we have to leave it there. Joyce, Issa, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Sherry Madera, CEO of CDP.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Bloomberg for actually putting data at the center of this day 2. I do have some slides, which I'm holding my fingers at. There we go. So what we're going to talk about today is data in the year of the global stocktake. And let's remember what a stocktake is. So a stocktake is a measurement. It's an audit. It is based on data. So I think that it's important for us to remember that we start there, but we certainly don't finish there. Because data needs to be able to be used to take action. That's what I'm going to talk about today. But first we need to think about what is CDP's story and what's our role here. So CDP is the global data disclosure platform for climate. I'm hoping that some of you in the audience already know what CDP is all about. But again, it's important right now to reiterate it. What CDP is a global solution to finding out where data and climate fit in. So what you can measure, you can manage. I'd like to use this as the title of our story. And let's call it a story. Let's do this right. So, once upon a time, three of our founders knocked on the door of number 10 Downing Street. And one of them is here today in the audience as well. Paul, you can hold me to account to make sure that I'm doing this right. So they knocked on the door to ask for endorsement, to say, we want to ask the global community of corporates to disclose climate data because investors need it in order to make good decisions. And those founders got the endorsement. And of course, this is a very logical endorsement to give. Because in our story, our heroes were asking to be able to fight something that is a villain that we all see as being incredibly obvious. That villain is the frightening prospect of climate change. So we have grown since that day. That day was 23 years ago. And these statistics show that actually that endorsement from number 10 is very, very well founded. And CDP has become a global norm. So as our story unfolds, we are going to see that there's some positive change here. And the data says that we've got 66% of global market capitalization that disclosed to CDP, 85% of the S&P 500, sorry, 86% of the S&P 500, I'm moving at pace, and that 24% is the year-on-year increase just from last year to this year. So this is a compelling, positive story, but it's also global. Our number 1 disclosure country is the USA, and the second one is China. The third one is Japan. Our biggest growth rate is coming from Asia. This is really important to make sure that we're looking at a global, comparable, and comprehensive data set that we're gathering. Not only that, we're sector agnostic. So our biggest 5 sectors are manufacturing, services, materials, agriculture, and transport. But it would be silly not to also call out the fossil fuel industry, which has increased their disclosure to CDP in the last year by 12%. So there's some good news on this slide. There's some good news in the data, but there's lots more to do. I think we're hearing a lot about renewables, as we should. 3 times the amount of renewables need to be in the market so that we actually keep 1.5 alive. And 44% of companies disclosing to CDP do not report energy consumption data. So we have work to do. But disclosure itself is not enough. It needs to be actionable data. It needs to be decision-useful data. So what are we doing about that? And I need to keep things simple for myself in a very, very complicated world. So I think about it in the ABCs of data. So the first one is access to capital. And 740 of the global investors, representing $130 trillion worth of assets, have said to us, please have our authority to go and ask our investments, our issuers for this data. Business efficiency and supply chain. We're also working with 340 of the largest and most influential global supply chains in order to ask their customers to disclose through CDP. That segment, the business efficiency and supply chain, grew at 24% year on year. Sorry, 27% year on year, above the 24% that is our average disclosures. You can imagine that. If your customer asks you to do something, you're going to do it. So the third one is compliance, and I think we're hearing a lot about that. And we're delighted at CDP to already have committed to being the first platform working hand in hand with ISSB in order to be able to have the first tagged and aligned data set in 2024. So again, we're looking at these compliance opportunities not only to be able to service the financial markets, but also to service all of the compliance needs going forward. So the ABCs of data are driving us forward. So we're building tools in our story. We're building also how to deploy them and how to use them most effectively. Because then we're going to be a little bit armed. We're going to be equipped. We're going to be prepared to fight the villain in the story. So business efficiency and the supply chain, this is how we're all growing here. From 11% to 14%, less than 3% have climate-related requirements that are not included in their contracts. This is all changing rapidly. This slide is going to be completely irrelevant in 6 months' time because we're seeing such incredible growth in this sector. Scope 3 emissions. This is another driver of why businesses are also disclosing to the supply chain. This is tricky business. Scope 3 emissions data is difficult to pull together. It is difficult to quantify. Even when we're talking about some of our compliance requirements, there's a leniency or an onboarding that's going on with Scope 3. CDP is seeing that, and we're working on how we onboard various different customers, various different businesses, various different cities, states, and regions in order to make sure that Scope 3 is an important part going forward. So we've got all these tools. We see where we're going. Some things are positive. We've got a huge amount more work to do. So what's next? I see 3 areas that I'd like to think about. Transition plans. Again, I think all of us have been hearing a lot about transition plans. And again, I try and keep things simple. For a transition plan, you need 2 things. You need a baseline, which is data, and you need a science-based time-bound target. And then, once you do that, you need to tell us the actions that you are going to take from point A to point B. If you're not going to tell us the actions, how is it that we can measure? How is it we can monitor? How is it that we can together course correct and make sure we get where we need to go? So again, data first and data every year in order to be able to create transparency in this system. Ooh, that's fun. Nature and biodiversity, the second point that I wanted to think about what's next. We're delighted at CDP to have had a relationship with TNFD since its inception, and our commitment to TNFD to map their data, new nature-based data, to their framework is on track. And we're looking at putting that into play and into the market in 2025. Climate and biodiversity and nature should all work together, and the data that underpins that is a real necessity going forward. Finally, this is one of the things that I think we should think about because we're all sitting here in Dubai. We're all at COP28. This is the stock take. Let's turn it around and think about where we started. What is the stock take all about? And how is it that countries can really find where their NDC commitments are going to go next? I think we're all waiting for how that turns out. But what I would say is that we really need to make sure that the country is also looking at the data that is being disclosed by the cities, the states, the regions, and they really only have a couple of levers, countries. They have their direct emissions, their direct actions, just like any corporate or entity. Then they also have policy, which is enormously important. I think we're hearing that in all of the corridors we walk. Sometimes that combination is very powerful in a country. Sometimes it's not. And either way, what we need to think about is a whole of economy approach. And that's where CDP fits in. When we look at non-state actors, adding to the data that we also have at cities, states, and regions, we can be an indispensable partner of making sure the next global stocktake looks at the entire economy. So if we don't do that, I just wonder what it is that we are actually measuring, what it is that we're tracking, because most of the emissions do come from the real economy. So I'd love to leave you all in this story thinking about not only what happens next, but also what we can do. I've heard a lot, and again, I'm a new CEO of CDP. Yeah, this is week 9 for me. So for me, this is important to actually get out into the open. I hear it a lot. Data's the problem. Data quality. Data's missing. There isn't enough data. I can't do it because the data. I invite you to think about it differently. In this story, data is on the journey with us. Data is something we need. It is the map, because we are the characters in this story, and we need to have a way of understanding where to go. We need to be able to know, as characters, what roles we play and how we can play them faster and better. And with data, you're going to be able to at least have that wind at your back, those tools in your kit bag. So I would say, perhaps we can think that data is the solution. And we can all contribute to that to build transparency at the corporate level and at the country level. It can help us all be the heroes. The end. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Mekala Krishnan, partner, McKinsey Global Institute, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Saleh Yilmaz.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Saleh Yilmaz. I am one of the senior energy analysts for Bloomberg Intelligence, based here in Dubai. And we are delighted to have Mekala Krishnan with us today, a partner at McKinsey Global Institute, based in Boston. Mekala, thank you very much.
Thank you, great to be here.
Great to be talking to you. So you published a report a few days ago. I want to get the name right. An affordable, reliable, competitive path to net zero.
Yes, this was my test, you passed.
Yes, and I hope I can succeed it. It's great. I encourage everyone who hasn't seen it yet to take a look. It is available on the McKinsey website. And obviously, this is a very complicated topic, and I think you and I could spend hours talking about this, but I think we only have 10 minutes. And there's a lot of great insights on that paper. But I'd like to start off by asking you about, I think, this challenge of the energy trilemma. So the 3 pillars of energy trilemma: energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And this is something that I've heard in almost every energy conference that I've attended in the last few years. In a lot of the conversations that I had with our clients on the topic. So clearly, this is something that's on everyone's mind. But my first question to you is, how should leaders think about alleviating poverty and economic development on one hand and achieving net zero on the other? So do you see synergies, or are there more tensions?
Great, and wonderful to be here. Thanks for hosting us here. So that is indeed the question of the hour, as it were. And in many ways, these are 2 independently important goals, right? It's vital that the world reaches net zero emissions. It's equally vital that the world drives economic development.
And in many ways, they are synergistic goals. If you think about the net zero transition, the very reason the world is undertaking the net zero transition is to avoid the buildup of physical risks and to protect lives and livelihoods, which is indeed a core development objective. So in many ways, they are intimately linked, intimately synergistic. That is one truth. It is equally true, though, that a poorly executed net zero transition could compromise a variety of objectives that are vital for economic development. If we execute the net zero transition poorly, we could compromise affordability of energy and materials. So imagine an energy system that is poorly designed, where we don't manage for the reliability of the grid, where we don't reduce battery costs. That could compromise affordability, it could compromise reliability. A poorly executed transition could also compromise competitiveness. Now, you talked about the energy trilemma. We went one step further and created an energy quadrilemma. So we talked about affordability, reliability, but also the challenge of competitiveness. For countries and companies, it's vital that the transition actually creates opportunities where, to the extent that sectors see a decline in demand and job displacement occurs, that we protect those that are most vulnerable from the transition. So there are many examples that we highlight in the research where a poorly executed transition could compromise these other objectives. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, though, is if we think about this net zero transition as not solving just one objective, which is emissions reduction, but actually solving 4 objectives: emissions reduction, affordability, reliability, and competitiveness. Not only do we advance development, but we do so in a way that actually accelerates the transition. Customers will be more likely to adopt low emissions products if they are affordable, cost competitive, viable. Citizens will be more likely to embrace an energy transition that ensures energy reliability, and I can go on and on and on. My father was in the Indian Navy, so I'm going to give you all a nautical metaphor, if you can bear with me. If net zero is our North Star, taking into account affordability, reliability, and competitiveness gives us a compass. It gives us a way forward to think about how we make decisions in approaching this transition.
That's brilliant. So when it comes to some of the technologies that will be necessary for the transition, especially the ones that are in early stages, sometimes prototype stages, sometimes concept stages, what measures do you think we can be taking to push the costs of these technologies down? And I know in the last 5 to 10 years, we've had a lot of technologies where we have brought the costs down quite a lot. But going from here and perhaps in the next decade, what else can we do?
Okay, so let me extend my painful nautical metaphor, and apologies. So we have the North Star, which is the net zero transition. We have our compass, but we also need a map, right? How do we actually achieve all of these multiple objectives that I've described? And I'll come back to your shiny objects in a minute, but for a minute, the non-shiny objects, I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug for this. There are a multitude of low emissions technologies that exist today that work, have low costs, and the world is simply not investing enough on. So examples of that include energy efficiency, reducing methane. The IPCC estimates that by 2030, about 20 gigatons of emissions, today we're emitting, if you count methane and CO2, about 55 gigatons. By 2030, about 20 gigatons of emissions can be abated by low emissions technologies that cost less than $20 a ton. So there's a bunch of not shiny objects that we are investing less than 20% of the amount that we need to invest in. So plug for the not shiny objects. So coming to the shiny objects now. It is equally true there's another 20 gigatons or so that costs more than $20 a ton, and about another, of that, about 15 gigatons that cost more than $50 a ton to implement. And so we do need to think about how we bring down the costs of these high cost technologies that are needed to get us to net zero. One way to think about this is to look at the full stack of emissions reduction we need by 2050 and think about the viability of technologies. Many of you have probably heard the mantra that we have many of the technologies we need to get to net zero, let's get focused on deployment. And in one way, as you will see, this is a common thread that runs through my remarks, the net zero transition is often a story of on the one hand, on the other hand. So on the one hand, we do indeed have many of the technologies that we need to get us to net zero. Most of the technologies that we need to reduce emissions by 2050 are beyond the lab stage already today. So that's the one hand. But on the other hand, only 10% of them are commercially mature. Think about that. Only 10% of the technologies that we need to reduce emissions by 2050 are in the commercially mature category. This means there's 90% that is not in the commercially mature category. About half of that is in what we would call early market stage. So these are things like electric vehicles where we've started to see demonstration, but they're still started to see deployment, but they still need fundamental integration and in many cases cost reduction. And then another half of that 90% is in technologies that are in the demonstrations phase, the prototype phase. And there in particular costs are quite high and need to come down. Which brings me to your question, which is how do we actually bring costs down? When I start talking about this, people automatically think I'm an engineer by training and that I'm telling everybody to go back to the lab and start inventing. And there's certainly some of that we need to do. But we also need to find other ways to really stimulate the power of the private sector to bring costs down, to innovate, and to integrate. We need to start sending early demand signals to give them certainty that markets will exist. We need to start to create collaboration across multiple private sector entities, across small companies, large companies, and we need to set ambitious goals to drive scaling and eventually drive large-scale deployment.
That's great. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I do want to ask you another question on bottlenecks, because I think as the energy transition progresses, it's safe to assume that we will have some bottlenecks in things like materials, land, infrastructure, and I think probably most importantly, in labor. So what strategies can be employed to overcome some of these technical challenges, and I think more importantly, to quickly increase the supply of skilled labor that will be necessary?
Yeah, so this again, I think is in the, we focus a lot on shiny objects, but there's actually just real stuff we need to get going on, and bottlenecks are an example of that. The good news is it's not actually, if you think across these bottlenecks of materials, manufacturing, land, raw materials, labor, it's not a raw lack of availability. Oftentimes, for example, enough land exists, but it is issues of lead time, actually planning enough time to create the right supply chains, to skill the right labor force. So accounting for lead time and accounting for what we call concentration risks. So when we think about materials, a large portion of material refining capacity is in a few countries, and we need to think about how to unlock that. For labor in particular, we have large pools of labor that are not being deployed to the transition. And so we need to think about how do we train the workers, how do we train workers and deploy them to the areas that they need to be most deployed in.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have, but thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Great to be chatting to you. And thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Laura Clarke, CEO of Client Earth, for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Freya.
Hi, Laura. Welcome back. This is
Thank
your
you.
second time coming to the Green Summit. Delighted to have you here. Before we kick off, just a reminder: if you point your cameras at the QR codes, you can submit questions, which Meg here in the front row will ask us, will pitch to us towards the end of our conversation. So, Laura, do you want to kick us off a little bit? I mean, you're all about climate litigation. Do you want to tell the room here just a little bit about what exactly you do and some of the big cases you've been involved in recently?
Absolutely. So at Client Earth, the clue is in the name. The Earth is our client. And we use the law to drive the positive change we need to tackle the climate, pollution, and biodiversity crises. And we're most known for our climate litigation, because those are the cases that hit the headlines. But actually, we use the whole life cycle of the law. So we work to strengthen the law by getting the right legislation in place, or even drafting it for governments. So when you get a really good EU deforestation regulation in place, for example, it ensures that any products sold in the EU are not complicit in any way in deforestation in their supply chains. So we work to strengthen the law. We use strategic litigation to hold governments and corporates to account for their climate commitments. And when you bring the right intervention at the right point, that can set a very powerful precedent and effect change. And thirdly, we build the field. So we train lawyers, prosecutors, judges. We work with community groups so that more and more people are equipped to use the law to drive the change for people and planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what has struck you here? What's been your mission at this COP? Yeah.
So our mission here, I'd highlight two big things that we're focused on. One is the importance of using the law to turn international pledges into real action. And so we're advocating for countries to have national framework climate laws which really set out across the board and across all parts of government how are you going to deliver. And really legislation, regulation is the key in making that happen. Secondly, the right laws, the right rules for fossil fuel phase out. And that's a whole mix of, we're obviously looking at things like subsidies, but also very important that we've got a very clear eye on things like greenwashing. And actually what we would like to see is something akin to the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, whereby there are limits on what fossil fuels can do in terms of advertising, sponsoring of events, or even a policy engagement. So you wouldn't invite tobacco companies to a health or cancer conference, for example. So those are our big objectives.
And we'll talk about some of your successes later, but of course, as you well know, climate litigation can be a bruising business, and you recently lost a case taken against Shell. The UK High Court dismissed your attempt to launch an action against the directors of that company for failing to sort of live up to their responsibilities as regards the climate. Can you tell us a little bit about the substantive issues of that case and how it evolved?
Absolutely. So it was a world first case. It was the first time that someone had taken a case against the directors personally, the directors of a company personally. And so it was a derivative action, meaning it was a shareholder action. As Client Earth, we held shares in Shell, and we argued that the directors were not doing enough to manage climate risk, and in so doing they weren't safeguarding the long-term commercial viability of the company. And our claim was backed by by institutional investors with 12 million worth of shares who said that this case was in their best interests. And really I think it's critical that directors, when they're thinking about long-term commercial viability, they are managing climate risk, and that's both the physical risk of climate events, it's transition risk, so what happens if you're investing in fossil fuels and they become a stranded asset, and there's also the litigation and reputational risk. The High Court refused to hear the case in substance, which we think is a real missed opportunity to clarify in legal terms the responsibility of directors, but it did acknowledge that directors have a duty to manage climate risk. And we're very clear, even though this has been a setback, it will only be a matter of time before directors are found personally liable for not managing climate risk. And that's hugely powerful in terms of influencing behaviors and decision making. And I think there's something there also in that, even though you lose a case, that doesn't mean it hasn't had impact, because the case has been talked about in boardrooms around the world.
Right, because we think, if you're not a lawyer, you tend to think about court cases as sort of like in the movies. There's winners and there's losers, there's cheering and there's crying at the end of it. But actually, it's more subtle than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. So this was a case that was talked about in conferences of general counsels, it was talked about in boardrooms around the world, and it sent a ripple effect around. So no one will be breathing a sigh of relief. And I think it also raises that understanding of the responsibility of directors to really lead in the long-term interests of a company and its shareholders.
Directors need to watch out because Client Earth might be watching you. I mean, oil companies, oil companies are the obvious ones, but are there other sorts of industries where similar cases could be taken?
So I think absolutely, and I think the big theme is this around personal liability. Yeah.
So greenwashing is another something else that you're very, very involved in. Can you talk us a little bit about the cases where you've had successes on greenwashing, and maybe some ongoing cases as well, just to give us a sense of how you think about this?
Absolutely. So we at Client Earth, we've had what we call our greenwashing files, which is a whole host of cases against greenwashing, which at its most basic is misleading advertising and communication. And our first case was against BP for its advertising campaign called Opportunities Everywhere, which suggested that the company was investing hugely in the renewable transition, when in fact, in the high 90s, 98% of its investments were still in oil and gas. And a result of that complaint, they withdrew that advertising campaign. And the CEO, Bernard Looney, said they would no longer do reputational advertising in that way. So that was a real success. We have two really interesting cases ongoing at the moment. One is against KLM, and we're supporting that case. We filed it last year. We're now supporting our partner in the Netherlands, Fossil Fry, and that's against KLM's advertising campaign called About Sustainable Flying, and its use of offsets, or Fly Responsibly was its campaign, and we're essentially saying that they are misleading the consumer and making them feel that it's okay to keep flying, because with the talk of sustainable aviation fuel and with offsets, that's implying that aviation is sustainable, when in fact the only real answer is reducing demand. And I think that's quite critical. It comes to a theme of false solutions.
Yeah.
Sustainable aviation fuel is in a tiny percentage. It's something like 0.1% currently. And we know that offsets do not compensate for emissions produced. And so it's a false complacency that is bred there.
And just to give, this is obviously a global audience here, just to give a sense of your sort of, your reach. Obviously, we've talked about UK companies, we've talked about KLM, a Dutch company. Are you just European focused, or are you also pursuing cases elsewhere in the world?
So we work in different ways in different jurisdictions. So we also work on we work with community groups. So in West Africa, we worked in Côte d'Ivoire to support local community groups there to improve the forest code and get a new forest code in place, which is now meaning that they're reforesting locally, which is incredibly important. In China, we train judges at the request of the Supreme Court of China. In the Philippines, we're engaging on regulatory reform to support the renewable transition. So we're working in different ways, using the law in different ways in different jurisdictions.
And just a reminder to everyone, you can post questions using the QR code, so we'll get some questions in a minute.
But I'll just come in. So, but the false solutions, I think, is interesting, because that's true also in the plastics industry. We talk about recyclability, where we launched a case recently against Coca-Cola, Danone, and Nestle for their claims that their plastic water bottles are 100% recyclable and recycled, when we know that actually only 9% of plastic is ever really recycled. And on the current growth trajectory of plastics, there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. So there are false solutions in terms of claims of recyclability. There are false solutions from government as well. And so we currently have a case against the UK government for its revised net zero strategy, which relies too much on untested, unproven, high-risk technologies like carbon capture and storage, and not enough on the things that we know work, like energy reduction, in terms of energy demand reduction, in terms of insulating houses, public transport, behavioral change.
Just to push back on a little bit, or if I was a government official in the Treasury, I might push back on that a little bit and say, let's take carbon capture. Yes, we don't have it to scale yet. It is a relatively nascent, well, it's not nascent, it's been around a long time, but we still haven't quite figured out how to scale it up. Many, many, many of the net zero projections, ratified by the UN, et cetera, concede the fact that carbon capture can and should be part of net zero solutions. Some might say that's unfair.
So it absolutely is going to need to be a part. But I think the point with this carbon budget delivery plan is it relies far too much. And so it doesn't all add up. And what you need to do is you need to do as much as you can in terms of emissions reductions and changing how things are operating. And then, of course, you're going to need carbon removal technologies, carbon capture and storage, and carbon credits for the really hard to abate areas. But if you say we've got, we're relying on 20%, say, being delivered by carbon capture and storage, that's not yet proven and tested. And so you need to have much more of really predictable, high confidence emissions reduction strategies.
Meg, do we have any questions?
We do. Sorry,
accepted a bunch and they disappeared on me. Hold on. Here they are. Okay. Can you comment on new legislation requiring alignment of financial regulators and NDCs?
Sorry, say again. Comment on.
Can you comment on new legislation requiring alignment of financial regulators and NDCs?
Globally, is that I mean, I think essentially regulation is really key because, again, this comes back to, I suppose, what I was talking about with the climate laws and climate compatible decision making is that you need to have, it's not enough to have a net zero target or even a law, you need to make sure that all parts of government and the state are having in mind those targets when they're making decisions. And so when decisions are made on, say, for a financial regulator on listing a certain company, how do they consider climate risk when they do that? And we actually brought a case against the Financial Conduct Authority for its decision to approve the prospectus of an oil and gas company when that prospectus hadn't set out clearly enough the climate risk of new investment in oil and gas. And so I think regulators, treasuries, any decisions that are being made on infrastructure, on investment, they need to have in mind the climate goal at hand.
What was the result of that case against the FCA? That's the UK Financial Conduct Authority.
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing.
Yeah.
Meg?
Do you believe shareholders will be the next to be held accountable?
Oh.
That's a good one.
That's a good one, and I don't know. I haven't heard about that, but I think there is an increasing emphasis on shareholders using their influence to engage and to try and influence. But it's an interesting one. I think that's very much a watch this space question.
One more?
Moving on from your landmark case against directors of Shell, what, in your opinion, is the threshold directors have to meet to avoid meeting Client Earth in court in the future?
I think, look, that's a really good question because I think what I always say is, as Client Earth, we don't want to make the best the enemy of the good. So there are so many, and one of the big stories at this COP is the huge leadership that is being shown by the corporate sector, the enormous efforts being made in leaning into the transition. And so we want to really support those efforts and say this is what good looks like in legal terms. These are the responsibilities of directors. This is what a really good Paris-aligned net zero strategy looks like. But it's then when you have a very clear failure to manage risk that we want to take action and really just try and set an example. And so when there's a complete disconnect between the statement, what an organization and its board says it's doing in terms of climate commitments and the reality, and where that might be the inadequate net zero transition strategy, it might be lobbying in a way that's totally counter to its stated aims in climate terms.
Can I pick up on that actually and talk about how you view the enablers, so the sort of the cottage industry around big engineering industries and oil and gas, et cetera, the PR firms, the consultancies. We were talking about that earlier, and it sort of sounds like one that could perk up a lot of ears.
I think if we're thinking about next themes and next trends in terms of climate litigation, I would say what I call the under-the-radar enablers. I mean, if you think about a new oil pipeline, you can't do it without getting the insurance, without the lawyers doing the contracting, without the PR company doing the PR for you. And increasingly, there are these concepts of advised emissions for consultancy firms, advertised emissions for PR firms, lawyered emissions. And I think the big thing I would say is all of us at scale across our economy and society just need to become much more climate competent, much more climate fluent, so that if you're a lawyer, if you're a consultant, if you're a PR company, you're understanding the climate science and the crisis, and you're thinking about your role, who are you working with, how do you influence them, should you be working with them? And I think that's really key.
And can you give me a sense, what would your legal argument be? Let's say I'm a consultancy, I'm helping an oil company, figure out how to do an M&A deal or figure out how to build a pipeline. I might say, look, oil and gas is not illegal. There's nothing illegal about it. They've asked me for a financial service. I'm providing them that service. I'm not on the, how would you argue the legal peril?
I think you could easily link it to it's essentially a greenwashing argument, but those who are enabling it, looking at misleading consumer practices. But it really depends. I mean, in a way, what we do at Client Earth is we start with the impact we're trying to have, and then we work out what the right legal vehicle is. So I think that's critical, that everyone is thinking about, no one says, oh, well, I don't know how to deal with computers. So everyone needs to be thinking about how they deal with the climate and what their responsibility is. And that law, I think, is a really powerful tool in concentrating the minds and thinking about what can we all do in our own way to drive the change we need to see.
Yeah. Meg, do we have any other final questions? Or I have one final one, but.
I can do there's a COP related one that might be a good one to end on, which is, do you feel like there's been enough climate litigation involved here in COP?
I think it's been talked about a lot, but it's not really part of the main program. But I think it is a very useful nudge factor. And in fact, just before COP started, there was a case in Belgium where the Belgian authorities were ordered by the courts to reduce their emissions by 55% by 2030. So it is really putting a pressure. And the other thing I'd say, which is a fascinating dynamic underway at the moment, are the advisory opinions before the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, which are asking these international courts to clarify what are the duties of states in tackling the climate crisis, in terms of whether that's for avoiding marine pollution or whether it's for the human rights of current and future generations in climate vulnerable countries. And so bringing that pressure from above, from the international courts, I think is a really interesting theme, and there have been lots of discussions about that this COP.
Well, one last closing question we touched on. We sort of touched on this earlier. But if you look out into society and the law and the courts reflect society, and it's like an ongoing conversation between the law and society. We are seeing more skepticism about net zero from the political level, from other angles as well. Is the judiciary becoming more conservative? Let's take the UK. Do you feel like the judiciary is becoming more conservative on climate affairs? Do you feel like they are more climate literate than they were a few years ago?
I think there's still a long way for the courts and for judges to become much more climate literate. I think that's absolutely true. I think that generally it's very interesting the way sometimes politics gets involved in climate, but actually when you look across the board, everyone wants their kids to grow up in a clean and healthy environment, to be able to breathe clean air. And I think the role that the law has is taking it beyond that short-term thinking of the next election or the short-term profit, and thinking long-term. And when you set the right laws and you set the right regulation, then actually you're creating that long-term thinking. And the courts are, of course, a critically important part of that. You need that long-term thinking for the long-term good of the planet and for people, and that's what the law can do.
Well, on that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you.
I have some instructions for you, so you might want to stay put before you walk out on me. We obviously have lunch that will be served right outside, so you can enjoy that out there. But if you did pre-register for one of our special lunch sessions, you're going to go up to the 7th floor. It's investing in the clean tech ecosystem or the future of carbon markets are your two options. So those are on the 7th floor. You just take the elevators upstairs. We will be back here at 12:45. I'm sorry, those start at 12:45. We will be back here at 1:45 with former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. So we will see you then.